Hello, lovely people. Welcome to Ari Talks About Music. I'm Ari, and today I'll be reviewing the new Arcade Fire album, Pink Elephant. Pink Elephant is the seventh album from the Canadian indie rock band Arcade Fire, who are a band who, over the last few years, I think have proven themselves to be one of those bands who, for whatever reason, just seem to be completely unable to kind of recreate whatever they had going on their first three albums. Having a genuinely fantastic three-album run at the beginning of their career, however, pretty much every album after The Suburbs has been at least mildly disappointing in some way, with their music going from this genuinely fantastic indie rock that is really unique and not really like anything I've heard, to the latter half of their discography, which is just this really kind of generic and often overproduced poppy sound that really just gives you nothing that their first three albums couldn't do 100 times better, which unfortunately is a scene that we continue to see even on their new album. With Pink Elephant definitely not being their worst album, definitely not. However, definitely still commits most, if not all, of the same sins as some of their previous works. Open Your Heart or Die Trying opens the album, and as far as instrumental intro goes, I definitely think this one's not too bad. It does create these very long and very lush soundscapes that actually sound really good, and the various electronic instruments in the mix as well are actually blended in quite well. I think there is definitely an element of it just being kind of a cheap copy of the opening track on Have a Nice Life, Death Consciousness, with that one just being overall more epic and a bit longer and just generally a lot better as well. But it's definitely far from the worst moment on this album. You do then also have a handful of interlude tracks scattered throughout the album that kind of call back to this moment, and I think that those interludes really do highlight, I think, one of the biggest issues with this album, which has got to be the pacing. Given that this album's only 10 tracks, it's only just over 40 minutes, and it is very slow and very relaxed for most of it. So on an album that's already very chill, having two entire interludes that themselves are reasonably long, considering that they aren't even full proper songs, really just makes the album feel way more bloated than it needs to be, especially even where they are slotted in on the album, they don't necessarily flow between the tracks all that well either. The title track does have some quite beautiful and genuinely really nice and soft guitar playing, although for whatever reason, Win Butler's voice on this track just sounds really strange and like he's trying to be overly dramatic, which unfortunately is not going to be the last time we're seeing that happen on this album. But other than that, I think this is genuinely a reasonably solid track. It does meander a little bit, especially in the first half, but ultimately it does end reasonably well and doesn't really leave you with all that much to be desired. And despite the pretty strong start that this album does actually have, I think that the track Year of the Snake is where it really does start to go downhill, with this song just being overall really messy, having so many instruments that just don't really sound that good in the mix at all. And in fact, just the mixing in general, I think, is one of the worst things about this track, because for some reason the percussion is so much louder than everything else, and it really just overpowers all of the other sounds, especially the vocals, which you can barely even hear. And I think that even outside of the terrible mixing, this track is just kind of boring, it's repetitive, and it really just doesn't have anything on offer. Circle of Trust is then just another very generic pop track. The production is a lot better, I can at least give it that, and also the attempt of a slight progression is also somewhat of an improvement on the previous track. And eventually the climax towards the end of the track is a decent enough moment, however, because it just spends so long meandering before it gets there, by the time the climax actually arrives, I'm just kind of bored with the song, and it does make it feel pretty meaningless. Alien Nation, I have to say, is by far the most annoying song on this album, with these weird and pointless vocal effects that make the vocals sound so muffled for half the track for some reason. Especially when you pair that with the genuinely well-produced instrumental on this track, it just does not match at all. And just then, of course, the constant repetition of the title for pretty much the whole song is just so annoying and earwormy, and really in the worst way possible. And then I do somewhat appreciate this track for not meandering and just pointlessly going around in circles before getting to an unsatisfying climax like the previous track does. However, I think that this track, in a way, almost has the opposite issue where it builds too quickly. And then so by the time you even get to the climax, it's just nowhere near as satisfying as it should have been, because you just didn't really have the time to take in what was happening, and it just cuts to the chase far too quickly. But luckily, it doesn't really matter all that much, because when you get to the climax, it just sounds awful and completely out of place, and just absolutely nothing like what the very short build-up was alluding towards. I do like Ride or Die for being a slightly more acoustic-based song, which really just acts as this nice little breather in this very overproduced and very synth-heavy album. It's just really nice to finally have some actually more organic instrumentation, and it luckily does actually manage to fit in reasonably well. I think it's one of the moments on the album that is actually slightly better paced. However, it's still extremely repetitive, which is kind of annoying, because this track did actually have quite a lot of potential, and it's one of the few tracks where I actually do like the way that Win Butler's voice sounds. However, for some reason, he just keeps slurring his words, making the lyrics completely impossible to hear. So as much as I do like his voice on this track, it's completely ruined by how he sings anyway. So definitely one of the slightly stronger tracks on the album. It just kind of lacks a little bit of substance more than anything, really. I Love Her Shadow is an absolutely beautiful moment on this album, definitely my favourite song. It opens with these very subtle but still really nice sounding synth effects that do eventually build into this really nice riff. And the progression on this track, although a bit generic, does follow a formula that I'm still always going to be a sucker for, that just slowly adds more and more layers as the arrangement of instruments just slowly builds. The lyrics are still pretty generic, however, I think that the delivery of the vocals makes it easy to look past that because it's still really passionate and genuinely does sound quite heartfelt if you don't pay attention too much to the lyrics. And the production being genuinely really smooth and not being too overbearing is something that I really have come to appreciate about this track as well, given how much that is not something I can say for the rest of the album. And I think of all of the tracks, this one by far has the best pacing, with the structure also being one of the highlights of it for me. And then Stuck in My Head is the closing track, and again is just so annoying and repetitive. Definitely has to be one of the weakest tracks on the album, especially just with the way that the title of the track is just constantly repeated for the whole thing. Keeping in mind this track is over 7 minutes long, so for that length it is just unbearable to listen to. And simply just because of how repetitive it is, the track genuinely does just get stuck in your head, like it says, which whether they are displaying self-awareness or it's just a coincidence, I don't know, but it does kind of add to how annoying it makes it. The fact that the phrase that is constantly being repeated is just stuck in my head. However, just because of the length of this track, it does still manage to provide one or two nicer moments, most notably right at the end of the track when he actually stops saying stuck in my head and changes up the lyrics a little bit, which I think this song needed to do far earlier. But it definitely does get more passionate as it goes, which is something I do appreciate. However, I think that it just still, like many of the tracks on this album, spends far too much time meandering before it really gets to the point. But ultimately, I do appreciate this track for ending well, as the climax, I think, overall does actually pay off. I think at this point, it's really hard for me to say that I was disappointed by this album, because Arcade Fire just haven't released an album I've actually really loved since The Suburbs all the way back in 2010. It does still have a handful of highlights, but on the whole is a very weak and very boring album more than anything. And as far as a conclusion goes, there really is very little I have to say about it, because it just really lacks a lot of substance. And like I said, more than anything, I think this album's biggest sin is just that it's really, really boring. And so I'm going to be giving this album a 4 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching this review. Please be sure to listen to this album yourself and tell me your thoughts below. Please leave a like if you liked the video, and please leave a dislike if you didn't like the video, and remember to stay hydrated.